Onze derde spreker komt uit Engeland. Hij is medeoprichter van een global bedrijf die nagaat of pensioengelden niet lijden onder de verkeerde investering in fossiele brandstoffen en dat mensen daar het slachtoffer van worden. Let's switch to English. He's done a lot of other stuff, but I think that's quite enough to introduce him here. Please give a very warm, although not a global warming welcome to Julian Poulter. Where are you? Oh, there you go.
Thank you. Technology works. Hello, Netherlands. Thank you for inviting me here this evening. You guys rock. I've just spent 20 years living in Australia. Just moved back to London. I'm originally from London. The British, they don't rock. With all their class systems and inequality and all those kind of things. You guys are much more egalitarian. And all this sort of anti-you things. I say, let them leave. But when Greece is going cheap, yeah, you guys get to buy the cheap stuff first. That's what I say. Netherlands, you built the first corporation, the Dutch East India Company. Yeah? Who remembers that? Yeah. And you also gave us the first financial crisis, yeah? Of the 1630s. And also, because with my Australian hat on, my half Australian hat on, of course you discovered Australia. So actually it's your fault that we're in this mess, because poor old Van Diemen, if he just hung around a little bit, and he went there, he discovered Australia, he decided there's nothing here of any interest at all. Did he not see the beaches, the coal mines, that kind of thing? If you owned Australia, you could just shut down all that coal right now. We wouldn't be having this discussion. It'd be much easier. But look, we're here to talk about money. How many ABP members are in the room, please? Okay, vast majority of, great. Anybody not like money, by the way? Well. Anybody want less of it? This is the daily business of pension funds, of course, and your pension funds. And they have a very, very tight rope to travel in generating return whilst taking due risk. And so there's no such thing as just return, there's only risk-adjusted returns. If I said to you, here's $1, I want you to go and double it by the end of the evening, you'd have to go to a casino. So we don't mind taking risk as long as we get rewarded for taking that risk. And what we're really here tonight to talk about is, are we getting rewarded enough for taking the volume of risks that we are? Here's the scenario. Does anyone remember the subprime crisis? It just seems so long ago, doesn't it? 2007. But we're still in it, by the way, even though people have changed its name and it's got some new acronyms and so on. But no. Trust me, it's still the subprime crisis. When just about everybody bought into the idea that there was a gravy train of derivatives, mortgage-backed securities. And we've got a very similar situation building now with carbon. The problem is what we call the fallacy of liquidity. And then that sounds very technical, but really it's a faith in the financial system to be able to sell risk when we want to. And unfortunately, there's whole layers of the investment chain who believe that that's possible over carbon in exactly the same way that they did in 2007. The fund managers who sadly have most of the power in the investment system, or I think we are seeing in our time a move back towards a greater level of financial democracy. But at the moment they call the shots. And they firmly believe in this ability to sell out whenever there's a problem. The reality is that around about half of a portfolio is exposed to climate change in some kind of way. Insurance, transportation, we've talked about fossil fuel extraction, stationary energy, agriculture, all of these sectors, add them up. There's no escape. So the reality of financial systems is it's not when Congress agrees to price carbon, the US Congress that is. What is it with those guys? It's not even when somebody designs a really cheap solar panel. Markets anticipate those liabilities and build them in very quickly. So economists like to deal in straight lines, and we in financial systems deal in very jagged lines. And unfortunately, reality tends to be very jagged. And this is what's going to happen one day. It's almost inevitable. Why is it inevitable? Because the things that create greenhouse gas are long term. They're all capital intensive assets. Oil rigs, power stations. We wouldn't be having this discussion if you could throw them away after 6 months. In infrastructure, in long term capital intensive assets, you have to build them first. It takes years to build them. And then you sit back and you wait for 25, 40 years of returns. And if somebody comes along and says, well, here's a carbon price, you're not going to get your returns, at that moment, people start to build in those losses, and that's where assets get stranded. So this is what we have to protect ourselves against. And you as ABP members want your fund to do it better than everybody else, because whilst we were talking a minute ago about the lack of a real market when it comes to pensions, I think that will change, and there's certainly a kind of virtual market over managing this kind of risk. You want ABP to manage this risk better than anybody else because your pension goes up relatively. So you've got a personal interest in ensuring that they have a superior strategy. And I'll echo some of the thoughts that went on the middle ground, but somewhere between moral and the moral case and the divestment case. But I'll come on to that in a second. The question is what you do about this. What can you do? The reality is, and this may not be very popular, that divestment as an investment strategy won't work. Apart from the fact that 80% of fossil fuel extraction is unlisted, it's just as much of a problem to have all the other things down the supply chain, the power stations, the heavy manufacturing and so on, needing supply. But that's not to say that the divestment movement won't solve climate change. In fact, that's not to say that the new financial democracy won't solve climate change. I think that we're about to see an era where pension members actually claw back some of the accountability and drive their pension funds. And if I'm at the top of a pension fund, I'm delighted by that influence. One of the problems, of course, is what sacrifices you have to make in the shorter term. That's the problem, isn't it? As human beings, we are very short term. It's next week's wages, it's next month's mortgage. The idea of sacrificing any return at all, even over the short term, is very, very unpopular. If we could get over that hump, then we wouldn't be having a lot of the discussions, and in fact a lot of the politicians wouldn't have struggled to do what they're trying to do already. We did some rough analysis. Here's the split of the capital. By far and away the biggest chunks in pension funds, a decent chunk of that's in ABP. On a discounted basis, it's only going to take about $10 trillion to solve climate change. So there's plenty of money. Okay, this is very doable. If we have to make this switch in capital to lower carbon investments, the question is risk and return. One of the problems, and we experienced it in 2007 when people went into renewables very heavily, is that people see them as risky. And because the renewables companies are smaller than companies like Exxon, they're not as stable, they don't attract as much capital, their cost of debt is more expensive and so forth. These are the natural things that go along with an economic transition. It takes time to scale them up. So there are risks. Here is the chain. This should be embedded in the memory of every single pension member on the planet. We can count about 300 million of them. China's growing its pension membership by about 10 million a year. It's a bit scary, isn't it? At the moment, too much of the power, because they buy and sell assets, is at the fund manager level. Interestingly, people talk about risk at the company level, but actually, for Exxon to have said, as they did last year, that there is no danger, as did Shell, no danger of us having stranded assets, was ridiculous. It's never 0%, is it? But the issue is, if I'm an investor, I can afford a fossil fuel company or two in my portfolio. I might like the fact that actually Exxon is marginally diversified into gas, and diversification is the king of portfolio risk mitigation. But I can't have so many companies all of one type that when you aggregate them to a portfolio risk, represent a completely new scale of risk because of that fallacy of liquidity. Because these guys are busy saying, don't worry, we've got all these clever analysts, and our analysts are going to spot the trouble 5 minutes before everybody else. And then just as the crisis has hit, you guys walk away with your pension intact. It's just not going to happen like that. We see one of the things coming is this. This is just a mock-up that one of my team sort of rattled up in about half an hour. But eventually, you guys will have the authority to, we think, influence voting patterns. And somewhere between the divestment of fossil fuels, and by the way, even though I said divestment won't work, there are great partial divestment opportunities available now. There is plenty of underweighting opportunities available too. But for the meantime, whilst we scale back these companies, we can't just turn off the lights, but while we scale them back, there's a lot of heavy engagement. And I have to say, ABP is one of the very best funds in this area in the world. And while it's all very easy to point the finger at pension funds, everything is relative. You should really, we've got our next global index coming out in the middle of next month. You can only ask of a pension fund that it is better than everybody else. There are so many difficult decisions to make, and indeed different loadings of pressure, because we have older members who are retired who are looking for shorter term returns. You have younger members who frankly aren't that bothered about the older members' shorter term returns. They're more interested in what happens when they retire in 20 to 30 years. They're hoping there's no high carbon economy then. So ask those two groups of members, are you okay with a short-term return sacrifice? And you'll get very, very different answers. And so how a pension fund with a fiduciary duty juggles those is part of the pension fund journey. They are human beings. They are themselves on a journey of great, great change. I feel very sorry for them in one regard, because in the middle of the 90s, pension funds represented only 15% of global capital, and now retirement savings are about half the value of the stock market. They've grown, their influence has grown. So we have to work them through that journey, but we certainly need to keep the pressure on. And here's one vision of how that might work. We think that it's not very long before you'll be asked for your opinion, and there's just a few examples of what we might be faced with this year. We think it's time for the financial democracy to really take off. It's not that we want members' opinions on morals traded off. We simply want the pension funds to show that they've done the appropriate base case assessment, that they've taken regard of the uncertainty, and ultimately, if there is to be a short-term sacrifice, that it is communicated back to the members in a way that makes sense. Governments don't like short-term sacrifices, and that's why we haven't got a carbon price. The difference is that we have greater control over the people at the top of the institutional investment system than we do over our politicians, who are, of course, controlled by the layer 3 levels below where our pension fund sits. Things are changing, and I'm sure that the pressure that people are putting on ABP will be felt in other pension funds in the Netherlands. And because of the way that you operate in the Netherlands, I know very much, as is already happening, of course, that your excellent example will be followed around the world. Thanks very much for your time. Happy to answer any questions later on.
Julian, Poulter, thank you for a well-balanced story. Thank you. Dames en heren, we hadden nu eigenlijk, we zijn een heel klein beetje uitgelopen. We willen een vrij strak tijdschema houden. We hadden nu de gelegenheid, als er hele dringende vragen zijn, om die nu te stellen aan de 3 sprekers. Is er iemand die echt heel graag iets wil vragen? Dan kan dat nu. Ja? 2 vragen. Nou, ga je gang. Ik kom even bij je. Katrien Kelt is niet dood. Wie ben jij?
Ik ben Mark van Baal. Ik ben van de beweging Follow This. Onze werktitel is Change the World by Shell. En ik wil eigenlijk aan alle sprekers iets voorleggen. Er is een alternatief volgens ons. Wij denken dat de wereld veel sneller duurzaam zou zijn als Shell zijn volle gewicht achter zet. En dat gaan we doen door massaal aandeelhouder te worden. We hebben een organisatie opgezet, een beweging. Op die website kun je in 1 klik aandeelhouder worden. We willen bij de volgende aandeelhoudersvergadering namens 10.000 mensen tegen Ben Verbeurde, directeur van Shell, zeggen: wij zijn jouw nieuwe aandeelhouders. Wij willen nu eens een keer dat je een stip op de horizon zet. 2030 ben je volledig duurzaam. Dat betekent dat je nu je winsten uit fossiel, die moet je vooral blijven maken, nu.
Ik ga je heel kort even onderbreken, want er wordt een boekenweek geschenkt. Wat is de vraag?
De vraag, inderdaad. Mijn vraag aan de zaal is: zouden jullie meedoen? Zouden jullie een aandeel kopen? En mijn vraag aan ABP is: zouden jullie ook meedoen?
Leuk. Zal ik het wel alleen aan het ABP stellen even? Want ik geloof, die sprekers geloof ik wel. Wie zou er allemaal meedoen? Dan worden we massaal aandeelhouder van Shell en dan gooien we het roer om. Al 4 mensen. Nou, het enthousiasme is niet van de lucht. En daar nog eens. Je hebt er al 20 binnen hoor, minstens. Ik vind het wel een briljant idee. Forget it? Forget it. Oh, een pessimist in de zaal.
Ja, dus fossiele brandstoffen voor Shell is natuurlijk een van hun absolute kernactiviteiten. En ze hebben hun alternatieve energieactiviteiten al voor een deel afgebouwd. Dus ik ben heel benieuwd of deze actie bij Shell succes zal hebben. Ik schat de kans niet hoger in dan 5%.
Maar als we toch met z'n allen de baas zijn als aandeelhouder, dan hebben ze toch geen keus meer?
Zoveel mensen krijg je nooit.
Aha, maar dat is toch een generatiekwestie, denk ik. Want als ze iets jonger zijn, hebben ze nog iets langere looptijd. José nog even.
Ja, als ABP beleggen we natuurlijk ook in Shell. Dus in die zin voor het beïnvloeden van Shell hebben we dat aandeel denk ik niet nodig. Maar maken we er natuurlijk nu al maximaal gebruik van onze rol en onze engagement richting Shell om hen aan te spreken op maatschappelijke klimaatverantwoordelijkheid.
En wat heeft dat geholpen in het verleden?
Ja, nou, daar gaan we het zo meteen over. Zo, de strijdbaarheid is niet van de lucht. Nee, maar als wij dan met z'n allen ook lid worden, ben je dan in ons kamp of ga je dan een beetje meer richting Shell, toch?
Nee, wij spreken Shell natuurlijk aan op de klimaat.
Nee, maar dan, als we met z'n allen lid worden, dan zijn wij allemaal aandeelhouders, samen met jullie, gezellig. Ben je dan aan onze kant?
Dan gaan we allemaal aan deze kant staan natuurlijk.
Oké, die is binnen. Dus als we met z'n allen, dan gaat José meedoen. Mooi. Er was daar nog een hele dringende vraag. Kan je hem brullen? Want dat scheelt uit.
Ik vraag me af welke rol, inderdaad, dus het sluit aan eigenlijk op de vorige vraag. Welke rol de energiebedrijven kunnen spelen bij de energietransitie. Vanwege de patenten, wat ik net hoorde.
In de zin wat Bill McKibben zegt, schaf die fossiel af, maar ga alle hernieuwbare energieën binnen het bestaande apparaat groot laten groeien, zodat de winstverhoudingen niet verstoord raken.
Ja, hebben de traditionele energiebedrijven daar een rol in?
Ja, die zouden antwoord kunnen geven. Nou, toch misschien even meneer Financiën. Zouden de traditionele bedrijven die rol willen overnemen?
Nou ja, dus de bereidheid bijvoorbeeld van Shell om dat tot nu toe te doen is helemaal niet groot gebleken. En volgens mij heeft het ABP ook geen enkele invloed daarop gehad. Ik ben heel geïnteresseerd in de zogenaamde goede invloed van ABP. Kunnen jullie die bewijzen aantonen aan de hand van historische aandelenvergaderingen, houdervergaderingen en dergelijke?
Gaan we zo doen in het debat. Goed?
www.abp.nl.
Kijk, José, je hebt hulp. Wat fijn. We hadden nu voor de mensen die echt heel nodig moeten, hebben we 2 minuten plaspauze. Daarna gaan we een petitie aanbieden en dan gaan we het daar heel strak over hebben. Dus daar is een deur met een mannetje en een vrouwtje. Wie er moet, ik zou zeggen ren. En dan over 2 minuten gaan we door. Tot zo. Oh, het zijn maar 2 wc's geloof ik. Dus. Dames en heren, als u de sanitaire stop optimaal heeft benut, mag ik u verzoeken weer te gaan zitten? Want dan gaan wij over tot een officieel moment, de aanleiding waarom we hier allemaal zijn. Zo, ik ga even wachten tot het helemaal stil wordt. Want dan ga ik